My wife would be down the country, particularly during the summer months, with the children, and I'd arrive down in the evening, and I'd have had a few vodkas on the way, and I'd have tried Gold Spot and Double Amplex, the whole lot, so as I'd sucking mints, so as to let her think I wasn't drinking. And she only had to look up my eyes, and she knew bloody well I was drinking, but I thought I was fooling her.
Now I tell people that if their family life, their occupation or their health is being affected by their continuous drinking, then something is wrong with their drinking pattern, and it's about time they stopped and took a long, hard look at their drinking pattern.
I'm a housewife, and I didn't think that this alcohol could catch up with me. I'm drinking since I was 21, and gradually it sort of increased, and I found that drink was beginning to be the most important thing in my life. I always look forward to functions like race meetings and weddings and things where there would be drink, card parties where there would be drink, and the people I mixed with were drinking people, and I sort of veered towards them rather than towards people I had known in previous years who wouldn't take a drink.
If that housewife had never taken a drink, no one, not even herself, would ever have known she had an illness. She might have got polio or cancer. Fortunately for her, it was alcoholism, an illness which can be treated. But because alcohol can be bought in shops, is legally licensed by the government, and is socially acceptable, it's hard to realize that it is a drug of addiction. And yet, 1 person in 20 who takes alcohol is an addict. The stereotype image of the alcohol addict, the problem drinker, being a dilapidated social dropout is totally unfounded. There are people with this illness in every walk of life.
I was a bright student at school, and I went to college, studied medicine. I began to drink in my second year in college. Immediately began to fail examinations. I had to leave college for a financial reason, shall we say. Then I sort of straightened out my life. I got married, settled down, got a job I'm still in, got a house. And I quietened. I felt myself that I'd overcome my problem, And then I noticed that as my financial position improved, so also did the intensification of my drinking go along parallel to it. So when I achieved what some people might call a form of financial security, my drinking reached its zenith, and it became uncontrollable.
Experts realize that there are many causes of alcoholism. It can result from a combination of the individual's own personality, his environment, and the critical quantities of alcohol taken. Precisely what is a critical quantity varies from person to person. In the early stages of the illness, a person may be able to hold large quantities of alcohol, but in the chronic stages his tolerance level usually drops. How do we know a person's drinking is heading in a dangerous direction? A doctor who specializes in helping the problem drinker explains the early symptoms of the illness.
The first thing is that a person who will develop a problem can see that in the early stages, alcohol became more important in their lives. If there was a birth, a marriage or a death or a wedding or a wake, or if they got married or didn't get married, whatever it was, they were inclined to over-celebrate or over-commiserate with alcohol. Not just a jar or two and going home, it became a session. In most civilized countries, people have a drink to stimulate the appetite. In Ireland, the men in particular usually seem to pull up to a pub on the way home from the office for an unwinding drink, and the car parks in any town are fairly full, in a public house car park I mean, at 5:30 to 6:30, but come 6:30 the majority go home. The person who's developing an alcoholic problem is inclined to say, I'll have one more drink. 7:30 he might go home, but more often than not he'll ring up home and say, put the dinner in the oven, I'm delayed with the lads, I'm talking business. He may arrive home at 8:30, he may arrive home at 9:30, but more often than not again you find his car is the car that has not left the car park when the social drinkers are coming out. Then if he does arrive home reasonably early, say 9:30 or 10, he wonders what all the fuss is about. The dinner's burnt, the children haven't their homework done, they're probably at this stage starting to bedwet or nail bite or mitch from school, and the wife is looking a bit haggard and she says, what kept you? And he says, I had a jar with the lads on the way home. And she says, you're always having a jar with the lads. And he says, God, you're always knocking me about my jar. They have a row. He goes back to the pub to tell his friends what a terrible nag he's married to, leaving at home total misery. Literally total misery. He can't see it, she can't see it, but the actual problem is alcoholism in its early stages. Another early sign is that the male again seems to become somewhat irresponsible. He's probably married with a small family. He's working hard all week. He feels the weekend is his weekend. Saturday morning comes, he goes to the match at 11:30 in the morning for a few drinks on the way there. He might eventually get to the match, but sometimes he ends up watching the match on television in the pub. He may in fact ring up home at 6:30 to say, you know, it was a great match, we're in town, come in and join us. Not thinking about babysitters or her day. He might go home then, or he might meet her and they go home at 11:30, 12 after a few more drinks. Next day is Sunday, he's hungover. He goes to the pub at 12 for a few unwinding drinks, buys the papers, sleeps in the afternoon in front of the television. Next day is Monday, back to work. It's been his weekend, forgetting that his wife and children are entitled to their weekend. The alcoholic problem drinker at this stage becomes irresponsible, somewhat irritable and very selfish. They live for themselves.
I have 5 children, ranging in age from 10 down to 1. And while I was in the fortunate position that I could give them everything that money could buy, I realised now that I was very selfish and that I didn't give them anything of myself, and that the rearing of them was being left to the wife, and she was playing a double role of being both mother and father. I was never home in time in later years to help the elder children with their homework, and if I was in time, it was because I was feeling rough and wanted to go to bed early. I made all the excuses that I couldn't remember any Irish and I didn't understand the new maths, and I just didn't help them.
I posted many letters as an excuse to go to the pub. Said I'll be back in a few moments, and once I was outside the house, then I was free to stay as long as the pubs were open.
They start to pretend they had less alcohol than they had. It's often called telling lies. I don't think it's telling lies. I think they actually believe they had less. But when you sit down with them and go through a day or a weekend's drinking, they're quite surprised at how much they've consumed. Apart from concealing your intake and pretending you've had less, other things crop up. And the first thing we see is the cure, the hair of the dog that bit you. Anybody who has to have a cure is an alcohol addict. And if they were on hard drugs and having a fix next day, it's the same thing. They're taking alcohol to ease the symptoms of withdrawal from the previous day's intake. In other words, they're alcohol addicts.
The next morning I would have to have a cure. I'd find myself in the shakes and in the sweats and all that sort of thing, and to go on and to be able to face the day, I would have to have a drink, and that would start again, and then I'd have one before lunchtime to give me another shot in the arm.
The actual cure doesn't mean a half bottle of brandy for breakfast. That occurs in the chronic stage, but it's rare enough these days. The actual cure could be a drink on the way home from the office at 5:30. They've had a very bad day and they've hung over all day, and the cure, they feel normal. As it progresses, they have to drink earlier in the day. They may have a drink at lunchtime. And any bar, you see them yourselves if you're in a pub having your own lunch, coffee and sandwiches. There are a number of people with problem with alcoholism who don't understand what is wrong, but they're drinking at the bar at lunchtime. It began off with a coffee and a sandwich, then it became a few beers and a sandwich, and then they hadn't time for the sandwich or the beers, and it was a few shorts. And in no time at all, it's 2 or 3 gins and tonic and it's lunch. And they go back to work thinking they're functioning normally. They do also drink with people who are drinking. You very rarely see a person drinking on their own at lunchtime, because this helps them to minimize their problem, and they say, well, sure, God, if I'm one, they're all one. In fact, most of them probably are suffering from alcoholism. As it progresses then, they find they can't wait till lunchtime, and they make excuses in the office to slip out at 11:30 for a cup of coffee next door, Maria, and they have a large vodka and tonic because vodka doesn't smell. But then they bounce into the office at 12:15, feeling that nobody knows. But to the people in the office, they are now a different person, and they've been behaving like a bull with a sore head all morning. And the office say, I wish to God you had that drink at 7:30 this morning, because they understand that there's a different person. And what's happening is he has been suffering from withdrawal symptoms all morning. He's had his drug, alcohol. He's now feeling better, and he can behave normally. Like any drug addict, the person with an alcoholic problem who is drinking suffers withdrawal symptoms. Now, another sign in the established stage of alcoholism is the gulping of drinks. You find that your company is not drinking rapidly enough for you, and you find that your drink is nearly always finished. What the person with the problem does then is he develops certain little ploys to get extra alcohol into himself without it being obvious. He goes to the bar to buy another round and has a large one himself in a long glass. Or if he can't do that without being too obvious, he goes upstairs to buy cigarettes and has a quickie at the bar. If he's caught by his companions, he says it's because he's a sore head or he's a stomach ulcer or the barman owes him a drink from last night. But what he's doing, in fact, is he's catching up on the alcohol level. He needs more than his friends. He's gulping the drinks. Now, at a certain stage, he's had maybe 3 or 4 more than the company. They aren't aware of it. He's in good form, and suddenly it's closing time. So he suggests, let's go back to my place. He doesn't want to stop there. And he goes on, they buy the half dozens and the half bottles, and he carries on. The person with the alcoholic problem doesn't seem to be able to stop.
I wanted more to drink more than other people that I was in their company. In other words, the volume that I would drink would be much more than what they would, and generally what I would do would be, when I'd be ordering a drink, I'd order a single for them and a double for myself on most occasions, and possibly have one at the bar while I was ordering as well. If it was a thing that the people that I was with were drinking pretty fast, I'd be quite happy, but if they were drinking pretty slow, I wouldn't be too happy.
Another sign in the established stage is the loss of interest in their usual activities. People who play golf are inclined to continue going to the golf club, but it's too fine or too wet or too dry for a game of golf. It's just right for a few drinks in the bar.
I used to play active sport like tennis, and I found after a while that with my hangovers I wouldn't be able to play the games that I used to play, and or else I'd be more interested in going to cure myself than playing the sport. And I'd go and watch sport, but it was always things like football matches where there was a bar, or that you'd be meeting the lads in the bar before you went to the match. Sometimes you made the match and sometimes you didn't.
I had been interested in reading, in listening to records, to music, going to concerts, and all of this disappeared. I didn't read, I stopped playing golf, I would not put on a record, just wasn't interested in it. Even during my dry spells, I could not regain the same interest.
Well, I tried to. On the surface, it might appear to some people that I made a great effort. I put on a good show, if you like. It took a tremendous effort, but in my heart and soul I knew I wasn't being as particular about anything. I used to take a great pride in homemade bread and homemade cakes and all that sort of thing, and then I sort of dropped that. I'd run out and buy one and pretend it was my own homemade bread and pretend it was my own homemade cake and all that sort of thing. And whereas I used to have a great interest in foreign cookery, I used to make spaghetti and curries and things like that, I ended up by giving them a boiled egg every evening for their tea, which didn't go down too well.
They begin to put things on the long finger. They say, I'll do it tomorrow. And the fellow who's living in suburbia with his little house and a wife and car and family gradually starts to put things off. He cuts the grass every Saturday, he washes the car once a month, he paints the house windows once a year. As the alcoholism develops in him, he decides to do it tomorrow. And eventually you see that the grass grows longer, the car gets more little dunce in it, and the house starts to fall into disrepair. And you see this, you can actually see a house deteriorating when one person in that house is suffering from this illness.
Putting things on the long finger, loss of interest, looking for a cure, a hair of the dog that bit you, going for drinking sessions, drinking more than the rest of the company, not knowing how much drink was taken, or hiding the amount of drink taken, being preoccupied with drink, being selfish and irresponsible. These are some of the symptoms of alcoholism. But there are other, more obvious effects. The physical damage that alcohol can do, for example.
Many people with alcoholism go to the doctor in the first place because of a physical complaint. It's either, my memory is not as good as it was, my stomach is terrible, I have palpitations, my hands and feet are tingling. This is the peripheral damage. And we have liver damage. Liver damage is the most important, and this is what most people die from. Anybody can drink too much now and then and just pass out. Only a person with alcoholism has blackouts. And a blackout is a period of memory loss for the previous day when you were not drunk. The typical example is you go to a party or a function that night, at night time, and you find that you're having a good time, and your hostess says to you, good night now, see you in the morning. You drive off home and everything's grand, but next morning you open the curtains and with relief see your car outside. You can't recall leaving the party. Or if the phone rings, you wonder, when the person says to you, what's keeping you? You promised to be here at 9:30. You can't remember having made the appointment the previous night. Now, the blackouts are very, very significant because they're the first sign of brain damage. If a person with an alcoholic problem goes on drinking, the blackouts continue, and the eventual outcome of alcoholism, of course, untreated, will be what we call Korsakoff's, which is a form of total brain damage.
In my case, anyway, a total blackout was a complete loss of memory as far as what had happened the night before, such as remembering where I had been, who I had been speaking to, and what I had done with the car.
The blackouts I had were mainly connected with a vague memory of meeting a certain group of people, but no idea whatever of the content of a long, long conversation going on over several hours.
Of course, there were self-induced blackouts, which was an excuse for not telling the missus the truth as to where I'd been drinking. I'd say I couldn't remember.
And even in watching television, I remember sitting down at night and Michael Parkinson might be interviewing somebody and I'd be there watching it all right and enjoy it at the time. The next day somebody would come in and say to me, what did you think of Michael Parkinson last night? And I couldn't even remember who he interviewed. I'd be maybe running for the paper to check up to know what went on. I'd be things like that. I was always losing things and misplacing them and hiding them and forgetting where I hid them. Even the empty bottles I would forget. I'd empty a bottle and I'd maybe stick it under the mattress and then I wouldn't remember where I put it and I'd be afraid maybe somebody else would come and find it and all that sort of thing. It was a desperate situation, really. Desperate.
We're seeing a different pattern of female alcoholic drinker these days. The usual thing was a lady wasn't recognised as having a drinking problem. What happened was she was at home, her husband was usually getting on in the world, the children were growing up, and she was feeling a little bit useless, not required anymore. Her deed was done. Husband was advancing in his business and the children were kind of leaving home and leaving school, and she was bored at home, and she found a little sherry helped her with the housework. After a few months she found a second sherry was just as good, and in a very short time she began to conceal her drinking from her family and was dipping into the housekeeping money and began buying cheap bottles of wine. And nobody would spot this. The husband would come home at 6:30 or 7 at night to find the housework not done, the wife looking a little bit upset, and the dinner probably burnt. And he'd say, "What's wrong with you, pet?" And she burst out crying and say, "I'm depressed." She was taken to the local doctor, who said, "What's wrong again?" She said, "I'm depressed, I can't cope." And he put her on tablets, and without anybody questioning the alcoholic intake. And within a few months she was hooked up on tablets, tranquilizers and alcohol, because nobody asked, "Are you drinking?" Nowadays we don't ask, "Are you drinking?" We say, "How much are you drinking?" And we ask the families how much. And it's quite surprising. The female problem drinker can go on for years and years and years, totally concealed, and they can appear quite normal when they're out, but at home they could be drinking heavily all day long, and they are very hard to detect.
I could have a lot of drink consumed and not appear drunk or appear intoxicated. Thus my family did not realise that I had a drinking problem until I was very far gone down the line. I blatantly refused to attend a doctor should he find out anything in my blood level or anything in my makeup that would indicate to him that I was drinking to excess.
Nowadays we're seeing the female problem drinker much more like the male, in that they're going to offices and they're going out to lounge bars with their friends and they're mixing out socially.
Alcohol can affect every facet of the drinker's life, even the most personal.
It does happen in certain cases where alcoholism can cause sexual problems in the marriage. And the usual thing for the female with the alcoholic problem that we see is she does not develop any form of promiscuity usually, but she becomes what's called an easy lay. She's available. She's in a bar drinking with anybody who'll talk to her, and there's usually somebody who will give her a lift home, and that's that. And you see these people slightly drunk in bars being picked up by usually younger men with fast cars, and they may have 2 or 3 children and a husband at home wondering where they are. It's very sad. The next day they wake up and they feel full of remorse and guilt, and it can be quite seriously depressing. The male with the alcoholic problem is more inclined to feel a desire for sexual activity, but his performance is not enhanced. The alcohol, as I think it was Shakespeare said, it stimulates the desire but decreases the performance. And occasionally the male with the problem goes home at night time and expects to have intercourse with his wife. And she knows that if she says no, there'll be a row. So she says, okay. They have intercourse and he finds he can't complete it. He can't because of his erection not being strong enough due to the alcohol. So he turns to her and says, what's wrong with you? He never blames himself. The person with alcoholism never seems to feel any blame should be on themselves. It's always somebody else.
Well, they say gin makes you sin and brandy makes you randy, and to my shame I must admit this is true. You're more inclined to chat up birds in bars and succumb to temptation when you're drinking than when you're on the wagon. And some of the most jaded looking old bats look like Marilyn Monroe when you've had a few on board.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Well, brandy or gin or whatever you have, you'd have a great interest in sex, and sometimes you'd live up to your expectations, and sometimes you wouldn't. More times you'd go and just fall asleep, and that'd be it.
As my drinking progressed, I found that any interest in that direction was only interfering with my drinking. Therefore, it had to be left on one side.
And the last thing is self-pity. Poor me. You know, nobody understands me, apart from about 15 different barmen who know what he's drinking all night.
On occasion I used to review my life, and to me it seemed to be a long series of failures, you know. And all these failures were attributed, in my mind, to bad luck, bad colleagues, inefficiency in other people, etc., etc., you know. And at no stage would I ever presume even to blame myself. Of course, during all that time I was drinking, and any person that had broached the subject of alcoholism to me automatically became enemy number one, to be avoided at all costs. And any person that offered information on the subject of alcoholism, I avoided them. If there were a film on TV, as there was one night, and I'd seen it advertised, Days of Wine and Roses, I made bloody sure I wouldn't be in that night.
The type of alcoholism, as I've described the signs and symptoms, really is the one we see most commonly. I'd say about 90% of people in this country who develop alcoholism have that type. But there are other types, well-recognized types, which do need treatment, the exact same treatment for the first type, and that is the bender drinker. They can go on the dry for maybe 3 or 4 months, but then for some unknown reason they hit the bottle and they might disappear for a long weekend, and then they stop it again for a few more months. But I've noticed with people with this problem that the bouts are getting closer together, and the time off alcohol is becoming less, and the time on drink is becoming more. In other words, they are evolving to the same type. And another type, usually a man who develops fairly severe physical symptoms from continuous heavy drinking, but yet his family and social life and occupation are not affected all that much. This is the man who comes home at 6:30 for his evening meal and drinks maybe a bottle of whiskey between 6:30 and 9:30 watching television and goes to bed. He doesn't go around beating up people or causing social scenes. This is a very common type, but it's very hard for him to understand that he is suffering from alcoholism because he's having no real troubles. The first thing he sees is his liver's damaged.
Many problem drinkers stop drinking for a time just to prove that they haven't got a problem. But it is the fact that they lose control when they begin to drink which indicates that they're suffering from alcoholism.
If a person with the illness wants to diagnose themselves, they should try and control it. If they say, I'll take 4 drinks a day in any one day, and no more, for 12 months, then they'd almost certainly, I think, not be diagnosed as suffering from alcoholism. But usually what they do is they take 4 drinks on the Monday, Tuesday, and then something happens on Wednesday and they have 4 or 5, and they rationalise having the extra 1 or 2, and then the weekend comes, they go on a binge. They very, very seldom, I have never seen a person with the illness being able to control the intake for a year. They can do it for a month or 2. If their health, their occupation, or their family life is being disturbed by their drinking, then something is wrong, and they should seek advice and inquire further into their drinking pattern.
If you're drinking now more than you were 6 months ago, it's time to look at your drinking habits. Remember that alcoholism is an illness which can be treated. It's the most untreated, treatable illness in the world today.